Anthropological Theory, Gender. Samuel Goldwyn, or Yogi Berra, or Casey Stengel once said, never make predictions, especially about the future. In true postmodern fashion, the quote is attributed to all three, and many others besides will never know who really said it first. And there is a website dedicated to tracking down claims for its authorship. http LarryDennenberg.com predictions HTML. It's impossible to really know the directions in which anthropological theory will move in the next 10 years. However, based on the tendencies of the last decade or so, it seems that work having to do with gender, power, and agency will probably play an important role in the discipline in this section. We offer examples of different types of work dealing with gender. As we saw earlier in this book, feminist anthropology was largely associated with the second wave of feminism, a social and political movement that occurred from the mid-1960s until the late 1980s. However, by the early 1980s, voices critical of second wave feminists began to emerge. They questioned not only the assumptions of second wave feminism, but also the very idea of waves of feminism. One charge made against the second wave of feminists was that they were largely white, middle, and upper middle class women who took their conditions as representative of the condition of all women. In her 1981 book, Ain't I a Woman? Black Woman and Feminism, scholar, activist, and poet Bell Hooks argued that not only had white feminists ignored women of color, but their actions had often worked to further oppress them. By the late 1980s and 1990s, additional critical works appeared. Among the most important of these was the 1990 book Gender Trouble, Feminism and Subversion of Identity by philosopher Judith Butler. Butler critiqued feminists for understanding the world in terms of a gender binary. Instead, she argued for an understanding of gender as a relation among socially constituted subjects in specifiable contexts that suggests that what the person is, and indeed what gender is always relative to the constructed relations in which it is determined. The work of Michael Foucault, described more fully in the French Social Thought, Postmodernism and Practice section, was particularly influential in helping people understand sexuality and thus gender identities as historically constituted and variable. Other works, such as the 1987 book Intercourse by Andrea Dworkin, 1946-2005, questioned the meaning of the act of sex itself and its role in maintaining male domination. Anthropologist Gail Rubin, in particular, revitalized discussion of the relationship between gender and sex. Her examination of lesbian and gay sexualities called for the identification, description, and denunciation of erotic injustice and sexual oppression. In anthropology, these intellectual trends broadened research and theory from a relatively narrow approach based on primarily around ideas of gender binary and oppression to a far broader understanding of the meaning and role of gender in different cultures. Among different groups in the same culture, Michela Di Leonardo writes that feminist scholars were forced to confront identities of women as they noted their own restricted demographic representation and research interest. In the 1990s, the question of difference expanded to include LGBTQ issues as studies began to explore the links between sexuality, identity, and social positioning and power. In particular, anthropologists focused on the social construction of gender and the ways in which gender intersects with a wide variety of forces linked to power and inequality, including race, politics, economics, and history. Anthropologists writing about gender also developed new experimental forms of ethnographic writing. They tended to emphasize multicality, that is, giving a voice to a variety of viewpoints in their ethnographic writing. They encourage members of marginalized groups to writing about their cultures for themselves and challenge anthropologists to take into account the discriminations of racism, homophobia, sexism, and classism. Barrar and Gordon, 1995, 7. Claiming that all ways of knowing are subjective, and some authors have offered works of poetry and fiction as new forms of ethnography. Others experiment with the epistemological assumptions of anthropology by introducing their own thoughts and experiences into their research. Our three choices for this section illustrate various facets of research in gender. The first essay is by Lila Abu Lagad. Abu Lagad is the daughter of the Palestinian scholar Ibrahim Abu Lagad and urban sociologist Janet Lippman. Abu Lagad, she received her PhD from Harvard University in 1984 and soon became known for her research on the Bedouin in Egypt. As of 2016, she is a professor at Columbia University. Abu Lagad's work is an answer to the critics of second-wave feminism who called for the recognition of class, ethnic, and economic differences between women. She explores issues of gender, power, and identity, and refers to herself as living a hybrid life. Balancing Middle Eastern and American influences, Abu Lagad called for new forms of ethnographic writing in her 1991 work entitled Writing Against Culture. There she argued that the writing of ethnography is inherently an expression of Western power because it is based on textual construction of the other and removed from the reality of the particulars of individually lived lives. Instead, Abu Lagad proposed that anthropologists write ethnographies of the particular. By this, she means that instead of writing broad generalizations about a whole group, anthropologists should write ethnographies of particular people in specific times and places. Abu Lagad's A Tale of Two Pregnancies, reprinted here in Essay 36, is an example of the autoethnography work that combines autobiographical information with anthropological analysis. Abu Lagad discusses her experience of pregnancy and contrasts it with the experience of Karima and an Egyptian Bedouin woman who had been pregnant during Abu Lagad's fieldwork. There is very little Bedouin authors in the text, most of which consist of descriptions of specific events during Abu Lagad's fieldwork related to her eventually successful attempt to become pregnant. While Abu Lagad is interested in issues surrounding the writing of ethnographies, Tom Bolstroff, 2004 essay, The Emergence of Political Homophobia in Indonesia, Masculinity and National Belonging, illustrates how changing political ideologies have placed LGBT citizens in the center of debates over national identity in Indonesia. Indonesia has typically been portrayed as a country whose people are tolerant of diversity in gender expression and sexuality and gay. Indonesians have used their society's existing gender diversity to claim legitimacy. However, in the last few decades, there has been increasing levels of violence against gay and lesbian Indonesians at public rallies and events, and Bolstroff argues that the rise in violence corresponds to the rise in popularity of a new national discourse of masculinity that is promoted by the Indonesian government. In this discourse, heterosexual marriage is identified as being the essential characteristics of modern citizen. Consequently, the attacks on gay and lesbians are more about the country's increasing heterosexism, in which non-normative sexuality is perceived as a threat to proper masculinity. Our final essay in this section is Lynn Kwiatkowski's 2016 essay, Feminist Anthropology Approaching Domestic Violence in Northern Vietnam. This essay is also concerned with gendered ideology, but Kiyokowski proposes that the work of feminist anthropologists on domestic violence can inform the work of government and the international aid agencies who are combating domestic violence. Conflicting ideologies that Vietnamese women must navigate when seeking help with domestic violence. Specifically, Kiyokowski's studies of how the Vietnamese government's promotion of Confucian values and international agencies' promotion of Western-style human rights simultaneously intersect and contradict each other, hindering the ability of Vietnamese women to successfully deal with abuse from their husbands. She argues that even when legal action is possible and women are able to act on their own behalf, many abused women are still caught up in the Confucian-influenced understanding of women's subordination to men and their obligation to keep their families together. Thus, Kiyokowski attempts to understand domestic violence in Vietnam as a result of the intersection of interpersonal, community, state, and international forces. In her conclusion, Kiyokowski argues that the work of feminist anthropologists can inform the efforts of international organizations and governments who will not be successful until they understand the cultural mechanisms and structural inequalities that perpetuate gender violence. The past 40 years, 1980 to 2020, have seen enormous growth in gender studies. Almost all major universities now have gender studies or women's study programs. Men still hold the majority of full professorships in anthropology, but women now make up almost half of most department faculties. While these women do not necessarily have a particular interest in issues of gender, it is probably true that the majority are sympathetic to gender-related concerns in university life in general and anthropology in particular. Despite their success in the academy and after almost over 8 decades of work in the area of gender and sexuality, anthropologists have not successfully translated their findings to the wider culture beyond an academic audience. The cultural clashes over women in the workplace, what bathrooms transgender individuals should use, marriage of same-sex couples in workplace, and legal discrimination against homosexuals, to name a few, continue unabated in the United States. However, continue unabated in the United States more than 80 years after groundbreaking studies of gender conducted by Margaret Mead. However, we find that the students today overall are much more open-minded than students of the past. They don't really care who someone marries or what bathroom they use, and they are for the most part accepting of non-normative gender expressions. It appears that generational changes in attitudes may finally catch up to where Mead tried to lead us in 1935. This is the end of this section. Sorry about that. Thank you.